I'm Darren Lance, Senior CWI and Experienced Quality Manager, and this video is for the newer welders and newer welding inspectors. Today I'm discussing the importance of welders properly placing their stencil on their completed or partially completed welds to protect their jobs and to meet the project quality expectations. Now, this does not apply to your fence welding or weekend projects, but rather heavy industrial projects such as structural steel buildings and pressure piping found in pipeline, petrochemical plants, and power plants and the like. Now, a stencil is a unique number or letter designation within the construction company to identify the specific welder, and all welder qualifications are linked to this unique identification called the stencil. Now, depending upon your company's quality manual, the welding code, and client specifications, the field welder is usually required to stencil each weld, and the shop welder usually places their stencil on the shop drawing. The weld inspector inspects the weld and records the welder's stencil for the weld log. Now, proper stencil technique will meet the code requirements and protect the welder's job, so other welders' rejected welds are not assigned to them in error by the welding inspector. Now, consider if you completed half of a weld on a pipe or a structural steel, and after lunch the project got rained out. Now, the next day you come to work just to find that the weld is completed. Well, who completed it? Did a qualified welder complete the weld? Did they put down their stencil? Or is your stencil the only one on the weld? Now, if your stencil is the only one on the pipe or the structural steel and it's x-rayed and rejected, you own the reject. How will the inspector know any different? So, what is your part of the weld and what is the other welder's part of the weld? Let's find that out with the best method for stenciling welds. So here's the proven method to stencil your welds to ensure that there's no misunderstanding. You take a project approved marker and you write a V next to your weld. And then when you get done welding, you place your stencil and indicate exactly how much weld that you deposited. So here welder Z did the root and the hot, and then followed by welder M did 2 fill passes, and he marks that, and welder T did 3 fill passes and a cap. Now, if you did your root and hot and then you got rained out, and the next day you came to work and the weld was completed, and the weld inspector came to inspect the weld, and all that he saw was Z, root and hot, and nothing else was applied, he would know that only welder Z did the root and hot, and he would have to investigate and find out who did the rest of the weld. If it cannot be determined who did the rest of the weld, then the weld would have to be cut out because there is no objective evidence of a qualified welder completing that weld. So this will protect you. If you just put the letter Z after you did the root and hot, and someone else welded this weld out the rest of the way, you would be responsible for all of the other filler metal in this weld. And if it was rejected, you would be pegged with the weld reject. Okay? Now, if welder B5, for example, welded the whole weld, he would put RHFC, root, hot, fill, and cap, off to the side. Draw a V and go B5-RHFC, root, hot, fill, cap. All right, so that welder did the whole weld. Okay, and if you're welding with another welder on a large bore pipe, you're going to mark the top and the bottom of the pipe on where your tie-in's at and what side. And you would only stencil your side of the pipe. The welder on the other side, they would stencil their pipe in the same manner with drawing a V. Now, another method that's equally as effective is to draw a T next to your weld. You put the weld number, welder and date, and then again, welder Z, he did root and hot on this date. Welder M did 2 fills on this date, and welder T did 3 fills and a cap on this date. Okay, both methods are very effective. I've seen them used individually, and I've also seen them used together. There's nothing worse than being assigned someone else's weld reject. So here's a side view of a weld, and with 3 areas of cluster porosity, right? So you got some in the root, you got some halfway up on the wall, and then you got some near the top. Now, based upon the root and hot, you know that this would be welder Z down here. And with 2 fill passes, this is near the top of welder M. And then this little cluster porosity here would be welder T, because he did 3 fills in a cap. All right, now let's look at an example here. So here's an x-ray with some cluster porosity, and as you can tell, it is near the sidewall near the top, because the edge of the cluster right here is right near the very edge of the weld, which would be similar to this here, maybe a little bit higher up. Okay, let's take a closer look. And you can see we got some cluster porosity here, and this left one here, and no doubt they were all done at the same time, but this little cluster right on the edge is right near the edge, so it's probably in the cap itself. All right, so this would be a very easy one to call, that whoever put the final fill pass or the cap in left this cluster porosity right here. So here's the 2 methods to stencil your welds. One is the hard stamp and the other is the paint marker. Both will be company provided and company approved. And here's an example of writing your stencil on the side of the pipe. And if you're using a hard stamp also, be sure to circle it. Here in this example, there is a hard stamp, but it's not circled and makes it very hard for the weld inspector to locate it. The weld inspector will locate all the stencils and enter that information into the weld log. So if you're not marking it and making it easy for the weld inspector to collect the information, you will not receive credit. Here T7 did the root, hot, fill, and cap. Also, there is a hard stamp on this, but it is not circled. Here the heavy wall pipe had 3 welders. 7T did the root, 88B did 2 fill passes, and welder 97B did the cap. Again, very clearly marked in the event of a reject. It's very easy to establish which welder receives the reject, and that information will be entered into the weld log. Here in the fabrication shop, a cut sheet follows the spool through the fabrication process. And in the top left corner, the welders will enter their stencil and their WPS that they use for each particular weld. And at the end of fabrication, the weld inspector will take this data to enter into the weld log. So here's an example of one of the attributes of a weld log that fabrication shops and construction companies utilize to track the productivity and the reject rates of the welders. Now, if you do not properly stencil your welds and do not get credit, it's going to appear as though you're not being productive. So you can see, for example, welder A, F, and H have very low productivity. Their reject rates are not bad, but lack of productivity will usually identify these welders as first to be laid off. So be sure to properly stencil your welds. Make it as easy as possible for the weld inspector to collect the data and for the data to be accurate. So let's further discuss the importance of the weld stencil. So when a welder stencils his weld, he certifies that its qualified welder made the weld within the welder's qualification limitations, all attributes of the correct WPS were followed, and the weld meets all attributes of the code and the client acceptance criteria. So for the weld inspector, the stencil allows the weld inspector to weld map the weld to the welder, populate the weld log. Welder stencil determines which welder is assigned any repairs, allows the inspector to mentor welders when they're not meeting the acceptance criteria such as cold lap and porosity or common plane requirements, and the weld stencil will be placed on all third-party non-destructive reports such as X-ray reader sheets, X-ray film, or PT reports. Now, once an NDE report has been completed, it's nearly impossible to have the stencil removed from the report, especially if there's a reject. Now, if you're notified of a reject and you know that you did not weld in an area or make that particular weld, ask for a meeting with the QC manager and your foreman to discuss. The foreman should be able to show in his progress reports which areas you were welding on each day. Now, most projects allow only a few rejects per each welder until the welder is fired, so be sure to properly stencil your welds. Now, an unstenciled weld that cannot be determined who welded it must be removed and re-welded by a qualified welder. When this happens, when a weld inspector says cut out the weld, the construction manager usually thinks it's the end of the world because this is a failure of the construction department welder, welding foreman, and general foreman. So for this reason, some companies require that the weld be inspected before the welder moves to the next weld to ensure that the stencils are correct and the visual weld inspection is acceptable. At the end of the project, the inspector certifies that all welds are completed to the company QC manual, all codes, and all client specifications. And the stencil is an important component of the objective evidence of weld compliance.